Good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Europe, good evening in Eurasia and in Asia. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful event to you today, The Axis of Collusion. It will feature a new report by Dr. Harley Balzer of Georgetown University. And after Dr. Balzer presents his new paper, we will have a panel, including Ambassador Daniel Fried, the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, Dr. David Schulman, the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, and Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick, Professor of Political Science at Montclair State University. All right, to set this thing in motion, I will lay out two broad questions to Dr. Balzer, who will then present his report. Harley, you write that Russia sees the relationship as more significant than the Chinese do. China's been busy building strategic partnerships, or trying to, with many countries. Why is there imbalance? Does Russia need China more than China needs Russia? That's big question number one. Big question number two. Putin and Xi have different views of their place in the international system. How does Putin see Russia and how does Xi see China? Are those views compatible? Harley, over to you. 10 minutes. And please unmute yourself.
We unmuted here. I'd like to start by thanking Ambassadors Herbst and Fried, the staff at Atlantic Council, Melinda Herring, everybody who helped put this paper together. I guess you could say this paper is, to some extent, my own personal rectification of names. I spent a lot of the past 2 decades trying to explain why the Chinese had managed to successfully transform a Soviet-style system of education, science, technology, economics, into something that worked much better, and the Russians couldn't. I hadn't anticipated what I call the Xi change, where China seems to have changed its direction, and dealing with that is important. And it helps explain why Russia needs China a lot more than China needs Russia, and why that Xi-Putin relationship is maybe not so strong. The focus on the relationship is mostly emphasized diplomatic and military relationship at the top. That's important. It's not the whole story. My emphasis is much more on the bottom-up relationships, or maybe more accurately, the absence of those relationships. All the things that have to be done lower down, grassroots, are not really happening. And the attention to geostrategy really seems to brush the mundane issues under the rug. However, the past 6 months, a whole slew of people across the spectrum in Russia have said maybe the relationship has peaked. I would say, except for a few months in the middle of 2014, after sanctions were imposed over Ukraine, the relationship was never that solid. And I'll emphasize 5 major points. One, it is a top-down relationship driven by the 2 leaders. They meet frequently. They put on a great show. They're effusive about each other in the relationship. I guess there are 2 ways you could explain those necklaces. One is it's a real demonstration of mutual effect, or it may be Xi demonstrating that the Chinese can reverse engineer anything that the Russians produce. When Putin gave Xi the necklace, Xi went home and invented a new one for Putin. I'd also say that the axis at the top has shifted from what Bobo Lo called an axis of convenience to what is much more an axis of collusion. The 2 leaders have done pretty much everything they can do top down. They have a sovereign internet they use to propagandize their views, control opposition. They have the sovereign right to punish and kill their own citizens wherever they go. They have a common front against the United States in areas where their interests intersect. And of course, they do the joint military exercises, which have a lot of people nervous. Even the top-down has limitations. Neither side has altered policy in areas where they differ. Recently, China came out supporting the Nord Stream 2 pipeline being implemented in Europe. Russia came out in favor of AUKUS, Chinese opposition to AUKUS. None of that costs anything to either of them. Joint military activity seems to be as much for psychological impact as for real cooperation. It's dangerous to dismiss it. I would not dismiss it. Both are highly capable. It's also dangerous to exaggerate. They have different emphases. The Chinese don't want to antagonize Europe, but they're very happy to drag Russia into their Asia-Pacific conflicts. Their energy relationship is a basic structural conflict. Buyers and sellers always differ over price, and the Chinese have consistently slaughtered the Russians on pricing. They've also reneged on sharing the cost of pipelines. They invest rather than going into partnership. The one exception to that has been Yamal LNG, which, as I'm sure Xi Jinping knows very well, is largely in the hands of a couple of Putin's closest crony wallets. Incidentally, America sells 5 or 6 times more LNG to China than Russia does presently, and just signed a bunch of long-term contracts. Anything involving business, professional groups, cross-border interaction, the bottom-up activity that makes a relationship solid is weak and probably declining. They sign lots of memoranda of understanding, science and technology cooperation, education cooperation. I'm kind of reminded of the Gore-Chernow-Bearden exercise back in the 90s, when the working groups, every time they were going to meet, had to come up with something for them to agree to. Most of those memoranda are not implemented. China can't really help Russia with the high technology it needs. They don't have it. China has done an impressive job developing science and technology, but there's a really important distinction to be made between consumer technology and high technology. Good example, the average machine tool Russia buys from Germany or from Switzerland is over $100,000. The average machine tool from China costs under $1,000. And that's not because the Chinese are that much cheaper. If China has reneged on investment in the energy sector, it's minimal in the real sector. And they're cutting back on almost everything except agriculture. The Belt and Road Initiative has done almost nothing for Russia. In the paper, I go into detail about the railroad lines. The Russian line from China to Europe is the least used and least effective. China is not doing much at all to help with regional development in Russia. The successes generally involve Chinese companies bringing in their own labor, and the Russians are left with the environmental damage. There's been a lot of hype about dumping the dollar, about alternative payment systems, about digital currencies. Russia has in fact been paying a lot to get rid of dollars. Their holdings of US debt are down from 170 billion to about 6 billion. China is still second to Japan at over 1.2 trillion. Latest data in October, the Chinese bought another $18 billion of US debt. They're not getting rid of the dollar. Mutual trade in dollars is really almost non-existent. Both countries have their own alternatives to SWIFT. They don't have a joint alternative. One Chinese bank has joined the Russian system. And finally, history doesn't end. There is a lot of backstory to this relationship. Russians now have a reasonably favorable view of the Chinese as long as they stay in China. For the Russians, the Chinese rank with the Gypsies as the 2 groups who should not be allowed to live in Russia. Chinese in school are taught about the unequal treaties with Russia. These maps show them very nicely. The amount of territory China has lost to Russia over the years. Chinese in school are taught about all the treaties being unequal, except for the 17th century Treaty of Nerchinsk. That one where the Chinese got territory that you can see they lost in the 19th century was legitimate. It was equal. All the others were not. And a couple of accounts lately have described visits to the museum in Aiwi, used to be Aigun before the Russians leveled it in the 19th century. It has a cyclorama depicting the Blagoveshchensk pogrom or massacre, where somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 Chinese during the Boxer Rebellion were killed by Russians who were nervous about what they might do. That cyclorama is pretty dramatic, and they check passports. Russians are not allowed in. That probably tells us something. And I guess I would end with some of the things in the paper that are implicit but not emphasized enough. Didn't do enough details about COVID. What we've learned in the last week is that neither the Chinese nor the Russian vaccines seem to be particularly effective. The Russians are ahead of the US in vaccine resistance, and there are going to be serious problems. The borders are likely to be closed again, and it's not clear how long that will last. And I will stop there and look forward to comments and questions. Thank you.
Harley, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. I especially liked your maps. Okay, Dr. Schulman, over to you. Has the relationship between China and Russia peaked, in your judgment?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to join everyone on this great panel, and thank you, Dr. Balzer, for that great presentation and for this paper. My answer to that question is the short answer is no. I think Dr. Balzer does a good job of demonstrating where a lot of these connections, the economic, the energy, the financial, and so forth, and certainly people to people, are still very limited, and makes the case that therefore the relationship is fleeting, and that these very real differences that we know exist between the countries will soon overwhelm the relationship. But first, I'd argue that it's still relatively early days in some of these underdeveloped areas. There's a natural economic complementarity between the countries. Russia has abundant natural resources. China has capital and technology to develop those resources. And in science and technology, for example, which is an area that's not really addressed too much in the paper, there are lots of plans in the works to cooperate on nuclear energy, to cooperate on data security, to cooperate on satellite navigation systems. And some of that may not come to much, but I do think a lot of it will. And I say that because of the structural drivers of the relationship that I think are going to give it legs and allow it to deepen. And I see the two main drivers of an enduring and deepening relationship as first, a collective opposition to what's perceived to be a hostile hegemonic United States. And Harley addresses that in the piece. And then secondly, a factor which I think gets short shrift in Harley's piece, which is a shared hostility to liberal democratic values and the rules-based order. And I think together they're likely to keep this a highly aligned, sticky, and strategic relationship for the foreseeable future. And in particular, I can foresee a significant uptick in collaboration in two key areas. First, in the defense domain. In the past few months alone, we've seen significant growth in military cooperation. Harley did mention we've seen more unprecedented military exercises in the Pacific. There have been announcements to jointly develop missile attack warning systems and other capabilities. And just last month, you had the country's defense ministers publicly dedicating to deepen defense ties. Harley underscores the importance of not ascribing outsized importance to these developments. And I think that there's some validity to that, or assuming that they're going to lead to an alliance. And I agree that China and Russia are unlikely to enter into a formal military alliance for a number of reasons, including the fact that they're not aligned geographically. There's deep mistrust, as we know. They're both focused on maintaining their strategic autonomy. And a lot of the advances that they're going to make in military technology are going to happen more in parallel than jointly. But I would caution against underplaying the importance of the defense relationship and its room to grow, even if we're not going toward an alliance. You have Russian-made systems that continue to be important to China's military modernization. Russia is going to continue to strengthen China's air defense and anti-ship and sub capabilities. Russia is going to keep looking to China for naval capabilities. And going forward, the countries are likely to pursue cross-collaboration in a bunch of areas like guided missile technology and unmanned systems, and potentially some other more sensitive systems. And all these military-to-military exchanges, these exercises we're talking about, are ultimately likely to permit Russia and China to execute potential contingencies like a joint intervention in Central Asia, or an expeditionary operation in Africa, or potentially the Middle East, or even a coordinated deployment in the Indo-Pacific in the event of a crisis. And I think they're also likely to continue to step up their intelligence sharing and efforts to counter U.S. intelligence operations in both countries. So that defense relationship has a lot of room to grow. And I think that's obviously of great concern to the United States. And then secondly, I'd say another area where the relationship really hasn't peaked is in collaborating to revise the global order and to degrade democracy and norms around individual rights. I think the regimes in China and Russia have a shared vision of a less democratic world that's more hospitable to their continued rule. This isn't about ideology, it's about power. And they're regularly now taking actions together and in parallel to realize that. And this goes beyond the kind of headline grabbing things like, their collective response to the Summit of Democracies, to proactively undermining democratic processes and bolstering friendly liberal regimes, and in multilateral institutions, watering down human rights protections and creating new norms around cyber and internet sovereignty and other things. And there's a growing recognition, I think, between both countries of the combined effect that they can have together. And so going forward, I think we're likely to see more of this. I think we're likely to see more overlapping and potentially compounding efforts to interfere in US domestic politics as China gets bolder in that space. I think beyond the US, we're likely to see more interference in foreign political systems in Europe and elsewhere. And I think we're likely to see more cooperation to pollute the information environment, both collectively undermining trust in institutions and democracy. And they're already benefiting from one another's digital communications platforms and sharing the same sorts of messaging on certain topics. And they've declared plans to cooperate more on new alternative information platforms. And I think that has the potential to really create an entirely separate information ecosystem that's attractive to a lot of democratic countries around the world. So I'd say in those two areas, especially cooperation on defense and on undermining democracy and the liberal order, it's clear that ties are not only deepening, but that there's a lot of room to grow and that we're nowhere near the peak. And I think those alone, without getting into other areas, are more than enough to form the foundation of a durable entente, if you will.
All right, thank you. Very interesting, very, very interesting. Okay, Dr. Wishnick. Harley says there's a range of views on the Russia-China partnership in the security communities in both Moscow and Beijing. How do elites in China view the relationship?
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. It's a pleasure to join this illustrious panel. That is a very interesting question, and I've spent some time talking to many Chinese Russia experts about this topic. I think that conceptually, the China-Russia partnership is important for Chinese foreign policy in general. The new type of major power relations that we often associate with China's approach to the United States actually came from China's approach to Russia. And so I think in terms of how foreign policy doctrine evolves in China, Russia has loomed large. A recent piece by a Chinese scholar, Xinjiang from East China Normal University, divided Chinese elite views on the partnership into two groups. One view, he says, is the bigger than alliance view, that there's no need to talk about an alliance because the China-Russia partnership is actually greater than any alliance. And I think it's a mistake to attribute China's reluctance to commit to an alliance to China's lack of interest, because traditionally, since the Deng Xiaoping era, China has said that it would never go into an alliance. And so unless the Xi leadership is going to contradict Deng Xiaoping on this point, they have to finesse the talk of an alliance. And so there is this line of thinking among Chinese experts that the partnership is greater than any alliance. There's no limit to this partnership. So they would certainly disagree about the Peking narrative. Of course, I mean, this is a reflection of pressures from the external environment, and there are aspects of this that might change. If, for example, sanctions were removed on Russia, Russia might be more amenable to cooperating with the West, Chinese experts say. Russia has other partners in Vietnam and India, and China finds this disconcerting in certain ways in Chinese academic publications. But also, I would say that China is a lonely power. In David Shambao's words, it doesn't have many choices for big powers to partner with. And so I think that the Chinese experts see a value in the partnership with Russia for that reason as well. The other line of thinking that Xinjiang mentions is the domestic drivers that we just heard about from David Schulman, talking about the authoritarian norms and priorities that they both share. And I would agree that this makes it very hard to drive a wedge between the two countries because they do have certain domestically important priorities in terms of their own regime stability that they see this partnership protecting. But I do also agree with Harley on the historical factors, because other Chinese experts do highlight that this, when we look at the China-Russia relationship, we can't start in 2001 with the signing of the treaty. You have to go back to earlier centuries and see the arc of history and how the relationship has ebbed and flowed. So there are some experts who would put more attention to history, and not necessarily only nationalists. You have more liberal thinking Chinese experts who would also say that we need to examine the role of history in this partnership. And also there's been some interest in looking at different identities, how Russia and China define themselves globally and regionally, and how this might set limits to the partnership. But I would, despite all of these trends, I would say that most Chinese experts writing about the partnership see the partnership as an important priority for Chinese foreign policy, despite some of its weaknesses and shortcomings.
Thank you.
And I would just add that, of course, censorship is an issue. So in writing, you're not going to have an open discussion of the fault lines in the partnership. But in private conversation, I think there is a balance in assessment that tends to tip, for most, on the side of the priority of the partnership.
Thank you. Very wonderful response. Ambassador Fried, Western sanctions on Russia have discouraged China from strengthening economic ties with Moscow. You, of course, were a major player in writing those sanctions in 2014. Was this an intentional part of the policy? How do sanctions discourage the Chinese from interacting with Russia?
In 2014, we were actually thinking about the long-term impact on the Russian economy if Putin kept up his course of aggression. And we weren't specific. We didn't do a Chinese country analysis, but we were perfectly well aware that we were making doing business with Russia more risky. And the Chinese are, as you said, not going to want to damage their overall interests by going all in on the relationship with Russia. But John, I had something else to add. I was listening to Harley present his paper, and then just listening to David Schulman, and I agreed with both of them. And I was trying to figure out how that was possible, right? But I mean, they're both really smart, but can both arguments be true at the same time? And I thought that they could be, because David Schulman outlined all the reasons why China and Russia want a top-down driven partnership or alliance, basically anti-Western, anti-liberal world order. And you see it played out all over the place. So David's arguments are right. But I didn't see Harley Balzer's paper as negating that. He's not arguing that David Schulman is wrong. He's arguing that David Schulman is right, but under that top-down partnership, which is real, and in the short run can be quite nasty for our interests, there is a hollowness to the relationship. Even more hollow, I would argue, than the Sino-Soviet perpetual alliance of the 1950s, which actually in some ways had more depth to it. And that couldn't withstand the forces of history. So I think they're both right. And I think Elizabeth Vishnik helped us think through the dynamics of that issue, the pluses and minuses. And then I have to say, my absolute favorite part of Harley's piece were the maps, the territorial issues. Why? Because Putin has spoken of the collapse of the Soviet Union as the collapse of historic Russia. And historic Russia, he defines as basically the maximum extent of the Russian Empire. It certainly includes Ukraine. And I thought, when I heard Putin say that, I thought to myself, well, a lot of countries have historic, there's historic Germany, and historic Sweden and the historic Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had all of Belarus and most of Ukraine. Okay. And I hadn't realized, of course, until Harley pointed it out, that there's historic China. And I doubt the Chinese have forgotten. So where do I come out on this? David is right. David Schulman is spot on right for the here and now. And the here and now can be a real problem. Putin could be going to war, a major offensive against Ukraine, like very soon. But Harley this is an important cautionary note. Harley's sitting on our left shoulder, whispering in our ears at this triumphant, axis of anti-liberalism marches triumphantly ahead. He's saying, watch out, it's brittle, it's hollow, it can be dangerous. But I think this discussion helps us think through this relationship in multi-dimensions, and I'm grateful to be on the panel, especially with experts who know a lot more about this than I do.
Daniel, thank you for going a little bit off script, but I think to our overall benefit.
Sorry, couldn't help it.
I'm going to follow you off script with one observation. Marvin Kalb has an excellent quasi memoir about his early years in journalism. And he writes about being early to see the coming Soviet-Sino rift in the mid-50s. And he went through Washington, and all the experts thought he was crazy. So there may be some precedent there. But okay, Harley, back to you. You write that China's FDI in Russia's real economy has dropped by 250% since 2014. And the economic ties that remain benefit China far more than Russia. Is China eating Russia's lunch? Does Putin realize this?
I think they've already eaten the lunch and they're starting it on the dinner. The Chinese have cut back across the board. Again, Russia has been clobbered on the energy prices. And there isn't really a whole lot the Russians can do about it. Does Putin realize it? Probably, but he is so intent on this attack on Western values and liberalism and America and making the world safe for autocrats that he seems to not care. I mean, a whole separate conversation is whether the entire Putin leadership is in a kind of late French monarchy mode where after us, we don't care what happens. I guess it's important to add that a few things I left out. Russia is selling more arms to India now than they are to China. They're trying to get around the congressional law that would somehow inhibit India from buying from Russia. They're also in a military arrangement with Vietnam. There are 3 countries that have fought China since the Korean War. And Russia, Vietnam, and India. Is this really that solid a relationship? It's a question. I agree that their desire to work together against democracy is strong, that there is a division of opinion in China, in Russia, probably here as we're seeing. And the one other thing I would throw into this is that Xi does not look quite as strong to me as he does to a lot of people. In the last 2 months, the Chinese government has said both that they want party members to have 3 children and allowed cities to cut the salary of high-rank cadres by 20 to 30%. Police chiefs in Shanghai are taking about a 5% cut. That contradiction tells me a lot about the Chinese economy right now. You're muted.
Sorry about that. David, Harley suggests that Russia-Chinese relationship is strongest at the top between the leaders, but sees little bottom-up linkages. Russia and China sign lots of MOUs, but there's little follow-through. Do you agree with that? How do you assess the relationship? And also, why was China only an observer at Moscow's Zapad military exercise this year?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. That gets at the heart of this, right? I think it gets back to Ambassador Fried's point and question in trying to put these two thoughts together. I think that, it is absolutely true that it is a top-down relationship primarily, for all the reasons that Harley lays out about, people to people and cultural ties and the history. And Dr. Wishnick also touched on this, enduring racism, lack of economic links. So it's very much driven from the top. But I think I have a different notion of what that means in these two countries with these two regimes and what it means for the durability of the tightening relationship. And I think you can make an argument that this is getting to almost as close as it gets, and you can build on it with these two political systems in this history. And I think that's why maybe making it this binary choice between a full-on alliance and something that's kind of an axis of convenience or collusion. I think that's perhaps not as helpful as looking at how tight these two countries are getting and where their similarities overlap and what problems that's going to cause for the United States and its allies going forward. Even if we posit that maybe 4 decades hence or even 2, you're going to have something that eventually falls apart. So I think first, it's important to acknowledge that the top-down drive in these two systems can achieve a lot over time in terms of gradually shaping the relationship also across the society. So you have, as Dr. Wishnick pointed out, the combination of regime control over information and censorship, and also the ability to tap into nationalism, both real and manufactured, regarding growing unhappiness with the United States. And that can be quite powerful in changing perceptions throughout a society from the top down. And we've already seen recent polling from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs that nearly 3/4 of Russians now have a positive view of China, which is a big change from a decade ago. And we've also seen some evidence of working level ties developing across the two governments, not just in the military space, as a result of that directive from the top down. But beyond that, I think to say it's just top down is to misunderstand that this is what actually matters most in these two authoritarian systems. And I don't think the key question when we evaluate the strength of the relationship is whether they're becoming more integrated as societies or even economies or S&T ecosystems, but asking whether they're forming a durable strategic alignment that's going to prove highly challenging to us. And the place to look at that is at the top. And I don't think, when I say that, I'm not just talking about the top two leaders, as I think Harley's primarily arguing, but on two centralized authoritarian systems that are driven in the same direction by the structural factors that I described earlier around the United States and around their common views of the democratic order and how to deal with liberal democracy. And so I think that despite Xi Jinping's clear leadership superiority in the system now, the approach to Russia by the Chinese Communist Party will continue more or less, even if Xi Jinping died tomorrow, barring some fundamental rupture in party control that came from that. And at this point, we don't even have a successor. We'll leave all that aside. But I think Russia would remain critical to the party's goals of ensuring its own security and control as its global interests grow, to fending off the threats from the United States, and to smoothing the path to true great power status that the party leadership has laid out for achieving at the centennial of the PRC's founding in 2049. And so I think if you had a relationship that was actually more bottom up, with economic ties across the border, people-to-people ties, more financial links, and a shift in regime at the top in either country could still fundamentally upend that relationship. And so we've talked a little bit about the 50s, and Harley makes this point in his paper about the inverse of the 50s. I think that's instructive. We had a bad relationship between Mao and Khrushchev. We had, who was more counter-revolutionary, not, ideological spats at the top, while there was much more widespread educational exchange and training across domains in society. And we know how that all worked out, right? Not just at the end of the 60s when it became apparent to everyone, but much earlier than that. So I think I'd argue that the structural dynamics are in place now for more of a lasting long-term top-down alignment that persists through the two political systems and, at least to some extent, drags along parts of the society and the economy along with them. And lastly, I would just say, I think this is what perhaps it looks like when two non-democratic countries with this kind of a history get as close strategically as they can get and then build from that. It's not going to be a civilizational connection, but what we have is more than problematic enough for years to come for the United States and for our partners.
David, thank you. I'd like to remind the audience that in about 5 or 6 minutes, we're going to start taking audience questions. So if you want to put them into the question part, please do so. But I'm going to call an audible here. And following up on what you just said, David, because you put a great stress on the opposition to the liberal order, the opposition to open societies as a major driver in the relationship. So I'm also going to mix metaphors, and I'm going to serve a fastball right down the middle to Dan Fried. So Daniel, given that statement, that analysis from David, what does that mean for American policy? That this China-Russia relationship, which is obviously against our interests, is also driven perhaps by their opposition to our values. What does that mean for us?
I think to some degree, the Biden administration has already priced this in. The Summit for Democracy was organized as a counterweight to the axis of collusion. No, it wasn't anti-Russian and Chinese explicitly, but implicitly it is rallying the democracies to deal with the authoritarian danger. It also means that the amateur's fallacy that we can somehow enlist Russia against China if only we give them Ukraine. That is the kind of thinking made up by boys who played too many games of Risk when they were teenagers. It's the amateur's fallacy, okay? It means that whatever the weaknesses of the relationship in the longer run, in the short run, it's real, okay? And it's nasty. Because those authoritarian regimes are threatened by the liberal world order, but they are also threatened in very different ways. China gets a lot from it. It wants to change it. It wants to change the rules to bend its way. It wants to exploit the system, but Putin wants to blow it up. Okay, there is a difference. And it's not clear to me that China is as virulent in its hostility to the liberal world order as Russia. So there are differences. But in the meantime, yeah, we have a problem. And, betting on democracies is where the Biden administration has gone. And not just. I mean, that is a tradition, goes, in the Republican side, it's Reagan.
Okay. Dan, thank you. You hit that out of the park. All right, Dr. Wishnick, this actually follows up on our diversion. Where do you see the fault lines in the relationship between China and Russia?
That's an important question. And I'm going to come back to this issue of the top down versus bottom up that Harley highlights in his report. I think he's right to focus on the weaknesses of regional integration between the Russian and Chinese border regions. They scrapped their 10-year plan for collaborative projects because so few had been accomplished. But having been to Vladivostok not so long ago, 2018, you do see some bottom-up ties there where Russians go to China to visit the dentist. You have Russian retirees moving to China. Real Chinese tourists are now coming to these Russian border regions. So there is some sense of integration of Russia into Northeast Asia and some bottom-up ties, just not the degree to which Russia aspired and China aspired or claimed to aspire earlier on. I do see Russia and China talking a lot about coordination, but before we assume from their speech that they are coordinating, I think we have to be careful about taking parallel actions for coordinated ones, or simultaneously occurring events like the Ukraine buildup and pressure on Taiwan as some kind of grand strategy that is a policy of this burgeoning partnership. So from my point of view, I've seen them act in parallel, but not necessarily on the same page because of certain fault lines. And now I'm getting to your question. And I think the fault lines are largely in the peripheries. so two key ones would be the Arctic and Central Asia. The Arctic, because Russia has asserted an Arctic identity because of its long coastline, the longest of Arctic states, sees China as an intruder, and that's where Russia has the dominant power. Russia can be the gatekeeper for China in that region, and it likes to keep it that way. You do have a private company of Novatech involved with China and LNG exports, so that's not it's kind of divergent from the top down, but of course the company is close to Putin. So that's an area where Russia wants to keep its sphere under its control. The Central Asia is going to be an interesting area to watch with the events in Afghanistan. How much is Russia going to tolerate China taking an more assertive security role in the region? And so, again, this is a region Russia has seen itself as occupying the security guarantor role. China had been primarily focused on the economy. Is that going to change? I think that's a place to watch to see how we can accommodate the two visions of Russia as a Eurasian power and China with its Belt and Road, seeing itself creating a new economic infrastructure through the region. Can these two visions coexist? So I would say those would be two places to watch for reasons of identity and also of history.
Excellent answer. And you also answered the question from one of the people in the audience with that. Thank you. Okay, Harley and David, do you have thoughts on again, possible points of friction between the two? I mean, you've already covered it, Harley, partly talking about history, but anything else you see current now?
Harley, go ahead.
The Russians are furious about the lack of economic assistance. They are not getting much out of this relationship. And I think that the top-down works as long as the two leaders are in place. I don't see a way of separating Putin and his cohort from China. That's almost impossible right now. Whether Xi can hold up with this transition, putting an end to term limits in the next year is going to be really interesting, given what's happened to the Chinese economy. And the Chinese people are fed up with the lockdown, but they're going to get more of it because their vaccine doesn't work against the Omicron variant. So basically, China managed to get, 600 million people out of poverty using the reforms in the 80s and 90s. That has almost stopped. If the economy is not growing fast enough, there is going to be pressure, and that is going to put pressure on this relationship. That's why they no longer will fund the Russians.
Okay, thank you. David?
Yeah, I would just add, and I think Dr. Wishnick and Harley covered it well, but I think in terms of a few other fault lines, first, I think India and the relationship that each country has with India is becoming more of a potential fault line in the relationship. Obviously, there's a lot of history there for those who've looked at what happened during the Cold War. I think, the China-India relationship is becoming much more fraught as that border conflict and dispute between the two continues to remain on the front boiler, and they continue to have occasional standoffs there, as well as just general strategic competition around what's happening in the Indian Ocean and a lot of other issues between China and India. So I think the fact that Russia continues to, and it seems to be increasing its relationship with India, especially in the defense relationship, is a key area to watch going forward. You could see, some of the arms that Russia is providing India could potentially be used in a conflict with China at the border with India in the future. So that's one. I think, Dr. Wishnick covered well a lot of the areas where there's natural tension over Central Asia and the Arctic. I think there's other places too now where China's really upping its relationship, whether it's Iran or Ukraine and others that I think have the potential to irk Russia going forward, where Russia obviously has significant interests, Belarus as well, and some other places. And then I think more in kind of a conceptual frame, and Harley, I think, touched on it in the paper too, this Russian sense of not wanting to be a junior partner in the relationship. I think that's a really big one, the Chinese are aware of that perception in Russia, and they bend over backwards to both avoid, not have these kinds of fault lines in the relationship undermine what they want out of it strategically, but also to pay Russia the respect that they know the Russians want in terms of being an equal major player, despite the fact that the Chinese view Russia as going in a different direction than China's going. That's I think something to watch very closely. I think, there's been a fair amount made in the past about the fact that Russia is much more willing to destabilize countries to achieve its aims and to undermine political systems, whereas China is more focused on economic gains and stability. I think that's a little less true than it used to be in the past, but I think there's still some validity there. So that difference. And then the other one that we frequently talked about, a decade ago, or even 5 years ago, was the fact that Russia was much more willing to have a fraught relationship with the United States, whereas China wanted, as Dr. Wishnick said, this new type major power relationship with the United States, and they wanted stability, and they weren't willing to kind of, wreck things and truly destabilize that relationship, and that was a difference between China and Russia. But with the China-US relationship going in the direction that it's going, and China much more aggressively and willingly, engaging in a confrontational relationship with the United States, I think that is less an area of difference between the two countries than it used to be.
Okay, David, thank you. All right, I'm going to turn now specifically to audience questions, even though I have a bunch of them that I wanted to ask. One is from Mark Katz, and it follows up on what we've just been discussing, and he addressed it to Harley. Do you see Putin's positive view of China, despite its growing strength vis-a-vis Russia, as something that is peculiar to Putin, or would a follow-on authoritarian Russian leader see the same logic of China as a necessary partner against the democratic West?
I think it is very much Putin at this stage, although the economic connections he's established for the people around him, like Timchenko and Rottenberg and others, may get them involved. It's why I think that getting change out of the Russian elite would be hard. I would emphasize again, the Russian perception of China is positive. The Russian perception of Chinese is not positive. That's an interesting contradiction. And it would not take a whole lot to change the perception of China itself.
Okay, thank you. All right, we've got an interesting question from Andrew Cutchins. He says it's following. The two countries signed their key border agreement in 2004, and Putin has often referred to this as the most significant achievement of his leadership. But the actual contents of this treaty have never been released as far as I know, with the exception of it supposedly being for 25 years. 2029 is not that far off. What are panelists' expectations on this issue? This comes back to Harley's map too, I might add. So, David, you want to give this a shot? It's not an easy question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I entirely understand. So the question is, what are the expectations for what's going to be revealed from that?
Well, I think what do you expect will how will border issues play out in the relationship, and can we expect changes beyond the relatively friendly relations we see today as we approach the end of this decade?
Well, I would say on the border issue specifically, I think, my expectation would be that, yes, while there may be still some, differences and not everything is perfectly ironed out, I think given the interest that both leaderships have, and I would say I can't speak to what Harley said on the Russia side, but as I said, before, I think even if we have something happen to Xi Jinping, I think things are going in the direction where the Chinese Communist Party is going to continue to value that Russian relationship for structural, strategic reasons. And so I don't think that they would allow differences over the border to get in the way of that fundamentally. And I think that gets into a broader, what do I think is going to happen by the end of this decade? I do not see any likelihood of change in the U.S. taking a tough position to what China and Russia are doing, unless you have a fundamental change in the Russia side again, but you're not going to have that from China. And I don't see any sort of change expected in terms of what these two countries are trying to do in terms of shaping the global order and the international system. And so with those two things in place, I think we can expect the relationship to deepen primarily in, as I said, the defense relationship and in those kind of areas around democracy and liberalism and individual rights. But I do think we'll also see maybe more haphazard, but more development in some of the other areas that Harley rightly identifies as lagging, whether that's in terms of financial interactions. Maybe there's some more movement, in terms of the digital yuan, so we get more towards the possibility of convertibility and then moving towards trying to take some action to replace the dollar. But I think fundamentally Russia's importance to China as a partner in helping to distract the United States from being able to focus truly, finally, actually this time on a pivot to the Asia Pacific to deal with China as the challenge of the coming generations, as this Biden administration has been trying to do over the last year. That is so valuable to China's leaders and to Beijing that I think they're going to go out of their way to really maintain the relationship and try to avoid offending Russian sensibilities about being a junior partner, and try to deepen the military relationship, and try to talk about potential contingencies in different regions and how to handle the United States in those kinds of situations. So over the next decade, or toward the end of this decade, I expect the relationship to deepen. And as I said at the outset, I really don't think we're near a peak.
All right, thank you. Elizabeth, do you want to weigh in on this as well?
Yeah, from my recollection, the Russian side did publish the details of that agreement, but the Chinese side has not. And that's because that agreement involved some small return of territory. And that might have been controversial to Chinese nationalists who remember the history, as Harley pointed out. I would have to say that some caution that we see in the cross-border relationship does stem from the border issue, though, with Russians wanting to insist on a fixed border point, while China's seeing more of a border zone, and Russians objecting to that. What would happen with the creation of border zones in terms of control and sovereignty over territory? So I think that these perceptions of borders do continue to interrupt the current relationship. But I also agree with Dr. Schulman that there are real incentives to address those problems and make sure that they don't interfere with the partnership because of the other pressing domestic and external drivers. But I would say that arms control issues might intervene in the future if, for example, China decides to deploy missiles farther north. How will Russia react in that kind of a scenario? And the missiles would not be directed at Russia necessarily. It might be in some situation if the U.S. deploys more missiles in the Asia Pacific region that China finds threatening. So there could be some unexpected border dynamics that could arise from the geopolitical tensions. Okay,
just I see Harley wants to in on this, but before we do that, Elizabeth, are you suggesting that the Chinese concept of border zones is attractive to China because this gives an opportunity to sort of exert some influence over what Moscow considers to be its territory?
I think that China sees its borders in a more fluid way than Russia does.
Projecting outward, not projecting inward. Correct?
Exactly, projecting outward because of historical patterns where China once previously exercised certain sovereignty, seeing some sense of historical legitimacy for infrastructure and development projects because of that past history. And that's not just a problem with Russia, it's a problem with Kazakhstan and with Mongolia and with other places in the neighborhood.
Yes. Okay. Harley, you want in on this, please?
Sure. And for all of us who played diplomacy back in college, it's a very long border. The most important thing about it is they've agreed on what it is, and therefore they are free to look in the opposite direction for the troublemaking they want to do. They don't have to watch their backs. On the other hand, the Russians are a lot more interested in securitizing that border. They have consistently rejected Chinese offers to build bridges, railroad bridges, open up communication across the border, and the Russians stymie it over and over again.
Ambassador Herbst, if I could just add one
Please.
thought on this too, which is that, China has settled or largely settled borders all around with partners all around its periphery. The one that obviously we know is it continues to be a big problem, and you also have some problems in Bhutan, but primarily is the India border. And that, I would argue, is because of the fact that there's significant concerns about instability in Tibet that are connected to that border, in addition to some of these nationalism issues and not wanting to look weak that Dr. Wishnick pointed out. And so the fact that that does not exist largely in the Northeast, where the border dispute exists with Russia, I think is another argument for why I wouldn't expect a lot of problems to arise from that dispute itself, if there's any kind of reveal that comes out when the agreement is made public.
Okay, good clarification. All right, we're almost at the end of our time. I don't want to forget Dan, and we've got an interesting question which ties our conversation to other big events. The question is from, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, from Alvydas Medalinskas. The question is this: could China come to help Russia if Western countries will decide to cut Russia off from SWIFT if Putin decides to send a large military force into Ukraine?
That's a fair question. SWIFT, just a cautionary note. I've been talking to senior bankers who understand sanctions. SWIFT is not the nuclear option of cutting Russia off from the international financial system that some people think it is. It's an important step, but there are a lot of financial sanctions that I believe the administration has prepared that don't include SWIFT and are very tough. So that's just scene setting. Would the Chinese help Russia if they were cut off from SWIFT? Yeah, they might try. They might even say so, but I'm not a banker. I'm not a treasury expert. But I think that the Chinese are unlikely to take great risks for the sake of the relationship with Russia if Russia invades Ukraine, and the Chinese would be unable to substitute integration with their financial system for integration with the world financial system. They haven't, as far as I understand it, they haven't the depth. So short answer is, they might say the right things, they couldn't do the right things. Yep. But again, the big financial sanctions are available to the US and Europe that do not include cutting the Russians off from SWIFT.
Okay.
And the Chinese have consistently stuck with obeying the secondary sanctions.
Okay. We have 1 minute left. Everyone has 15 to 20 seconds to answer the following question. Should and can the United States encourage a split in the China-Russia relationship in the near term? Harley?
It is possible that we could convince the Chinese that Deng's reforms were working, Xi has undone them, and they really need to change what they're doing. They need partners in the international system, and Europe and America are the most likely ones.
Okay, thank you. David?
Well, it won't be surprising that I disagree with Harley on that one. I don't think there's any chance of convincing China to do anything different than where the direction they're heading right now, especially with us and what they're doing inside of their system. So, and I don't see much possibility right now to create wedges. If there are any, it's in long term in terms of trying to help convince Russia that their long-term security and future does not lie in a deeper alliance, if you will, with China. I think what we need to do instead is be devoting more resources to figuring out how to deal with the fact that we are going to be looking at a very collaborative and deep relationship between China and Russia for the foreseeable future.
Good. Elizabeth?
I would agree with that. I don't see a wedge approach as fruitful or likely to succeed. I think we would do better to to try to manage the Sino-Russian partnership, as we just heard, but also to try to find areas where we have an interest in working with Russia and China. I mean, even in the Cold War era, we managed to work with the Soviet Union in certain areas. And I think that there are certainly areas where we have an interest in working with Russia and China and focus on those rather than trying to drive wedges between them.
Thank you. Daniel, last word is yours.
Short term, no chance of driving effective wedges. But throw out, especially to the Russians, the consequences of where Putin is driving them. Russians don't like being told that they're rapidly becoming the junior partner of the Chinese. Play that. But in the short run, keep your expectations under control.
Okay, thank you all very much. It was a very good conversation, and thank you all for listening in. And we'll be doing more on this subject probably in a few months, and maybe before that.